But De Valera stayed on as Fianna Fáil leader until 1959. John A. Costello of Fine Gael was twice Taoiseach during this period, in 1948 and again in 1954, on each occasion for 3 years with an inter-party government, thereby ousting De Valera's Fianna Fáil from power.
I have had the privilege of being in the Dáil for a large number of years and have had many discussions with him and debate on all sorts of topics. I had an opportunity of watching him. I had an opportunity of listening to the not always unflattering observations of my colleagues in the Fine Gael party on his actions from Easter week onwards, and especially during the period of the Civil War. He was undoubtedly a forceful personality. He had strong views. In my opinion, one of the most characteristics of his personality was his pertinacity in adhering to principles or ideas which he had convinced themselves were the proper principles to be followed or the ideals to be sought after. He thought very, very deeply and for a very long time, changed his mind frequently, but if he eventually came to the conclusion that what his view then was the proper one, nothing could convince him that he was wrong or get him to change.
And one such issue on which he could not be budged, in Costello's opinion, was De Valera's opposition to coalition governments, any government formed from more than one party. This was a core Fianna Fáil value for De Valera.
Mr. De Valera disliked coalition government to the day of his death. In the last government, when they visited him in the park, after they had been appointed by Dáil to the government and to receive the official appointment from him, he used to explain to them, I understand, how he disliked partition, how he disliked coalition government, as he called it, and gave them certain advice as to how they could carry on the almost impossible task that they were taking. He didn't like it. He always wanted an overall majority.
And Costello commented on De Valera's legacy.
I often wonder, and have wondered since he became president, whether the effect he has had on the country during his period of parliamentary rule would live on after him to any greater or lesser extent. I have formed the view, I hope correctly, and I believe correctly, that on the day Mr. De Valera was elected president of this country and entered into the park on his duties, his influence on this country as a parliamentary Democrat and politician ceased for all time. So he has in my opinion, he has left nothing of permanent value.
Well, John A. Costello, as we will hear presently, qualifies that towards the end of this programme. But next, from Andy O'Mahony's discussion series on the reputations of those who have held the office of Taoiseach. Historian John M. Regan and De Valera biographer Tim Pat Coogan.
The years in opposition trained them in parliamentary, the party generally, in parliamentary procedure, and also they didn't have to take the rap for a lot of the stuff that come the nail after the rebinding of the wounds, as he said, of the Civil War, the sheer cost of it, the difficulty of maintaining the Irish currency against a hostile British treasury. There'd be a lot of residual hostility from the Anglo-Irish War in 1916, and a lot of pro-unionist sentiment to be contended with. And he was able to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds where the IRA were concerned. The enemy of my enemy is my friend policy worked well there for him. And then, of course, the crash of 29 would have left any government with a terrible financial mess on its hands. And then, while that was going on, the architects of the new state, the Come the Nail people, had done a lot internationally, which he was able to build on, the Statute of Westminster and so on. So he was able to decouple a number of the links to the Crown and so forth, and bring in the more Republican-sounding constitution as a result of that. And generally, things played into his hands. I think he was lucky in a lot of ways. The Eucharistic Congress came along, gave him a lot of publicity when he came in. As John A. Murphy said, he was very Catholic, very assiduous to show he wasn't the man who had been excommunicated and they didn't have to fear for him. And he generally built on both the mistakes of his enemies, like cutting a shilling off the blind pension that Ernán de Blas did, and some of the good ideas that the Republicans threw up, like Padder O'Donnell's and Colonel John Moore's land annuities idea, with the retention annuities, though that had a terrible backfire.
Sure, but just staying at the early years and the period of transition, John Regan, the impression one has.
So may I just make one point? And above all, I think you have to hand it to him that there was a democratic transition.
Yes.
I mean, he took the baton, which had been handed to him, very nobly.
I mean, the impression one has, John Regan, is it was of continuity rather than any kind of radical change.
Yes, I mean, if one takes the longer view and looks at de Valera's policy and power from 32 onwards, we're really in effect looking at a lot of the ideas, a lot of the progressive ideas of Collins and from 1922. And in a sense, the idea of the quest for sovereignty that we witnessed during the 1930s are, in a sense, the implementation of some of the things that Collins is saying during the treaty debates in 21-22.
Martin Manzer, in his assessment of de Valera, comments in the light of the role he himself, Manzer, played in the Good Friday Agreement.
Politics is about maybe three things: ideals, persuasion, power, and I personally don't like a politics that is divorced from ideals, that is purely about persuasion and power. And I think he was an inspiring leader. Now, that doesn't mean to say that that everything that he advocated in the way that he advocated it, it would necessarily be appropriate for today. But for example, in the Good Friday Agreement, I was heavily engaged in the negotiations over constitutional reform and accommodation, and the principle of consent and its relationship to self-determination was much debated, in 1921 at the time of the treaty, and I find it very interesting to. I think there is a view that this was somehow principle of consent was introduced into Irish politics by people like Garret Fitzgerald in the late 1960s. I think in reality they picked it out of the debates of 1921, 1922, and I think de Valera's argument, which Lloyd George didn't accept, is okay if we allow unionists the right of self-determination and consent, will you allow us that? And of course, Lloyd George, while welcoming the promise that we weren't going to coerce Ulster, wasn't prepared to give any promises that he wasn't going to coerce us.
John A. Costello was Taoiseach twice and faced de Valera across the Dáil, with de Valera as leader of the opposition.
He was a great man, great courage, very controversial, rather dictatorial in his outlook, almost impossible to move once he had made up his mind. But nevertheless, he had an extraordinary charm of manner. It used to interest me, intrigue me, really, when I met foreigners coming over to see our party, the Fine Gael party, as they often do, after interviewing Mr. de Valera, how extraordinarily enthusiastic they were about what a charming man he was and what charming characteristics he had, and how greatly he was able to persuade you against your own will to his point of view. Many people didn't find that charm of manner. I recognize it as being there, but I think I may say that it was not unduly influenced by it.
O'Mahony's review of the politicians who had been Taoiseach, John A. Murphy emphasised how de Valera exploited his Spanish name, his arrival in provincial towns on a white horse dressed in a cloak, with a torchlit procession to greet him.
Union used the phrase messianic, and in part referred to his kind of theatrical trappings, the black cloak and so on, the strange name, and that exotic dimension was exploited to the fullest. But as well as that, we must remember that he was the last of that kind of Irish leader. In other words, when people applauded his reply to Churchill, they were really applauding him in the same way that people applauded Daniel O'Connell, allowing for differences in political development. In other words, he was speaking for them, and whatever shortcomings they've had in the real realms of economics and so on, he responded to a line, I think, for self-respect. That was what was behind really his success of the constitutional progress from 1932 onwards, that people needed that kind of declaration of self-respect.
You don't know how come.
Just say on Tim Paslick of that he was best at getting power. I do think that in the area of understanding Ireland's likely place and safest place in international relations, I think that De Valera brought to that. When he came into power in 32, he had been thinking about this, perhaps regretfully, since the treaty split. In fact, I think he'd been thinking about it certainly since 1920. And I think as in international terms, I really think he was far-sighted. He had a clear sense of what a small state could or couldn't do, how it could try to box clever and stay out of trouble, not only in terms of the wars that came, but in terms of building understandings with other small states. He had a very definite view of how small states in the international community, and he tried to work that, and I think he was remarkably successful in it.
John Regan.
He was the best.
John Regan, yes.
He was the best political intellect to survive the revolution, and he was also blessed in his enemies. In terms of Collins' elimination in 22, Cosgrave was a good leader but second-rate by revolutionary standards. O'Higgins was dead in 27, and then you have Cosgrave again and O'Duffy opposing him during the 1930s, and then Mulcahy and Costello in the 40s and 50s. None of them were of an equal intellect, and none of them had his political sensitivity.
Did he hold on too long, or who would have told him that? John.
Well, one of the reasons why he's out of fashion is that even when he died in 1975, yes. he was already out of fashion at that stage. He lived too long. He lived too long in every sense, really. And in the end, his fate was the opposite to Michael Collins. In other words, he was no longer seen as a hero, and he died peacefully in bed. And to die in your own bed is unfashionable nowadays. Makes you much less of a hero. So yes, he outlived his generation. He should have gone, of course, with hindsight, sometime in the late 1940s.
His legacy, you agree, you're saying the Fianna Fáil party, John A.
Well, I think, quite clearly the Fianna Fáil party is still the dominant party in the state and likely to continue to be. But also his legacy, I think, was the creation of stability. In the state. Mind you, in a 26-county state. Yes. Because De Valera was first and foremost, despite all his rhetoric, he was a 26-county man, and when the chips were down, put the the interest of the state first.
Tim Pat Coogan added a postscript to that programme.
But I think if I just may approve a lighter note, it was the ineffable quality that he had, the indefinable quality, and it was summed up by one of his great admirers, one of the Honan family in Clare, who wrote a memoir, which they kindly gave me, and he came in the 27 election, and he got out of a car in Clare and he walked over to the south and he said stop, because there's a likely voter there sitting on a ditch, and he said stop before we canvass this guy, and they went over to him, and your man took the Judine out of his gob and said, would you be some of them political gentlemen down from Dublin? And De Valera opined that would be a fair description. And the old fella spat and said, you're wasting your time, we're all for Dev down here.
And from the 1973 archives, a report from the Merriman Summer School. De Valera was the subject of the summer school that year. The contributors to this programme were T. Desmond Williams, Emmett Larkin, Liam Dupuer, Peadar O'Donnell and John A. Murphy. Sean McRaymond was in the chair. This is how the programme concluded.
We've just over a minute left, and in that minute I would like you all perhaps to make 1 or 2 points that you would briefly, that you would feel that you would like to say about this subject. Johnny Murphy?
Well, I think he will be assessed as a very great leader of the Catholic Gaelic nation, and that sums up his achievements.
And Larkin?
I think his real achievement is the building of and the maintaining of representative institutions in this country. Ireland, for whatever it is a democracy, and it is a functioning democracy.
Peadar O'Donnell?
I think it just belongs to Irish history, and it's a wee bit too early to assess his values.
Liam?
I think his great gift was that he never pushed too hard or too fast. He always held something in reserve.
And Desmond Williams?
My only comment is that none of us here have really made any observation as to his defects.
On defects, we've already heard the harsh verdict, recorded on the day of De Valera's death, incidentally, of John A. Costello. But here's something else Costello had to say at the time.
We have had many achievements in this country. I dislike personally to hear people saying we're 50 or 60 years now in government and we've done nothing. When I recollect what Ireland was in pre-1922, even pre-1916, and compare it with the present day, I can't contain myself with indignation against those people. We have achieved, whoever was in office, great things for this country and improved our standard of living, improved their way of life, improved their prospects, and secured for this country a place in the United Nations.
And Costello concluded with this final tribute.
Outstanding and above all things which must be granted to him, and which I believe even by his implacable enemies and those who disliked him and his policies to the end of their days and to the end of his days, is the fact that he at all times and in all circumstances was prepared to give his own life for the people of this country and for the and for the country as a whole. That, I think, greater love can no man have, and that he must get, in my opinion, peremptorily.